with the recording.
Yeah, you can go.
Right. So on some of these topics, there are kind of well-established NLP tasks. There's shared tasks on hate speech detection. There's standardized data sets. And on some of those data sets, there's classification models that perform pretty well. And this type of standardization is pretty useful. This is what facilitates model development. And it's also important for ensuring reproducibility of results when we have these kinds of standardized data sets. But what's getting left behind when we take these like complex real world tasks and try to turn them into standardized NLP tasks is aspects of these tasks that are difficult to standardize. And if we, to give kind of like a little bit more, I don't know, concrete examples on why these tasks look different in, say, a social science space than in an NLP science space, can think a little bit about like broadly kind of what are some of the differences in approaching problems that from more of a social science perspective as from more of an NLP perspective. And when you're looking at kind of more social oriented questions, a lot of times you really don't know what you're looking for. We don't know how to define propaganda. I mean, I know it when I see it, kind of recognize it, but it's not something that we really can build a reliable classifier in any setting that's going to say this is propaganda, this is not. And that's kind of different from a lot of the approaches that we see in NLP research, where we're often working on tasks that are pretty well established and defined. In kind of a social science space, if we can just figure out what we're looking for, that's like half of the research question itself. The other kind of difference here is a lot of times in social oriented questions, the data that we want to work with can be really messy and unstructured. And that's kind of different from when we try to take these tasks and turn them into an NLP setting where we're using well set up reusable data sets that have been kind of nicely parceled for NLP models. Some of the other kind of differences and considerations as well, and this is something that I'm going to kind of focus on a lot today, is in a social science setting, we really care about measuring the right value. And this is something that like matters a lot. We have to think about, could we be capturing some other related correlation, some value that's correlated with what we want to measure, but not actually what we're trying to measure. And this is something that's like really important if we're looking at a social oriented setting. But a lot of times in NLP, we evaluate models based on their test set accuracy. And as long as we're getting good accuracy on the test set, don't always care as much exactly like where that accuracy improvement is coming from. And I'm generalizing a lot here. Certainly there's a lot of people who would say like that's not true in an NLP setting. But in general, that's how we're measuring performance in NLP is on test set accuracy. And finally, the last thing, and I'm not going to talk about this as much today, but I'll touch on it a little bit, is that in the social science setting, we care a lot about the interpretability of the models that we're using. We really want to know why we're seeing the results that we're seeing. In NLP models, while we care about interpretability, we often care about like model performance more. We're usually not willing to sacrifice model performance for interpretability, but in kind of a social oriented setting, often we are willing to do that. And so if we try to like summarize this overall, a lot of times when we're looking at some of these problems from a social science perspective, what we really care about is being able to understand and explain what is happening. Whereas often in an NLP setting, we're defining tasks that focus on predicting particular values. So that's like a little bit of an overview. If you're kind of interested in this area, this comparison I drew from like sort of opinion piece written by Hannah Wallach a couple of years ago, and I think is really helpful. It's like 3 pages, so if you're interested, you can check it out. But to think a little bit about, so like how do we go from this sort of traditional NLP setting in these types of well-defined NLP tasks to be able to address these sort of broader explanation-oriented social science tasks. So how do we do that? Well, what we want to be able to do is expand the way that we develop these NLP models in order to address these kinds of broad challenges. And some of what we need in this kind of expansion is we need developments on the modeling side. So we need to build models that can generalize to new domains, that produce outputs that are interpretable and that produce outputs that we can trust. But some of what we also want to do is to be able to integrate theories from other fields. And this includes theories on how to incorporate social context and isolate variables of interest. So a lot of these kind of challenges that we're looking at in NLP settings are not entirely new. We're seeing them in different contexts, and we're seeing them at more global scales in ways that haven't previously been a problem. But we can still draw from existing methods and frameworks in other disciplines in order to approach them. Okay, so I'm going to talk today mostly about two main projects that focus on doing this, and then I'll talk a little bit about some of the broader implications of social-oriented NLP research at the end. And what these projects focus on doing is developing NLP models to look at complex data sets within their social context. So the first project that I'm going to focus on was a highly interdisciplinary project. And this is a project that I worked on, as well as a couple of other NLP researchers. And the reason that I'm showing you who was on the project is because I also want to mention that we were working with an economist and a political scientist on this project. And what this project focused on was characterizing media manipulation strategies. So one way that we can characterize news content is in terms of its factual correctness and its intention to harm or manipulate. So in the top left, we have mainstream media outlets, which usually at least aim to be factually correct, and usually are not aiming to harm or manipulate readers, at least in comparison to other sources. We have down in the bottom left here is content that is not necessarily factual, but also really isn't about harm or manipulation. So we have things like political satire. It's not factually correct, but it's intended to provide humor. It's not intended to be manipulative. In the bottom right is where we see a lot of work in NLP, and this is on detecting content that's factually incorrect. So misinformation detection and fact-checking work falls here. And this area of work, there's like a lot of work that fits into this space, and it can become very complicated. But one of the kind of starting points here is usually the assumption that there is some sort of ground truth value. Usually a fact-checking model in an NLP setting has some trusted data source, and the project focuses on identifying if some new claim can be verified against some existing trusted source. You usually have some sort of like ground truth data here of something that you believe. But what I'm going to kind of focus on today is things that fall in this top right corner. And what we see in this top right corner is content that is intended to be harmful or manipulative. So that is focused on things like propaganda, but that isn't necessarily factually incorrect. So identifying types of manipulation strategies that fall into this corner is really difficult because we really don't have any ground truth value. So strategies here can be really subtle and hard to detect, but they're also very prevalent. So I can give you a couple examples, hopefully some of which you've heard of. So Cambridge Analytica was a technology company that probably you've heard the name before, but if you don't remember, this was a company that was accused of harvesting Facebook data and using targeted advertising to attempt to manipulate a number of events, including the 2016 US presidential election, as well as a Brexit vote in the UK. And the activities of this company was exposed by whistleblowers in 2018. So as another example, so let me kind of mention here, but actually before I move on, that the strategy behind Cambridge Analytica's manipulation was not necessarily about spreading things that were fake or factually incorrect, but it was about targeted advertising. So it's opinion manipulation, but the strategy is not about specifically misinformation. So that means it's not something we could detect with fact checking. And kind of a similar example, this was work that was done by a group of political scientists, and they analyzed a corpus of leaked email archives, which detailed social media posts that were made by government employees in China. And these were posts that were made as part of these employees' jobs. So they're sort of like state-sponsored social media posts. And what they found in analyzing these posts was that many of them contained generic positive messaging. So things like motivational quotes, expressions of patriotism, and that these posts were largely timed around events like anniversaries of protests. So this was presumably a way of distracting from and disincentivizing collective action, but through positive messaging. As a final example, this was work that was done at the University of Washington, where I am now. And this was done by a professor in the information school named Kate Starbird. And her lab conducted an investigation of polarizing content in Black Lives Matter posts on Twitter. This was a couple of years ago. And after they did this initial experiment, Twitter released a list of accounts that were believed to be owned by Russian government operatives. And these researchers realized that many of the accounts that they had originally identified as pursuing polarizing strategies, as for pushing for polarization in this kind of narrative, were ones that were included in this archive leaked by Twitter, or ones that were thought to be backed by the Russian government. So we know that these kind of information manipulation campaigns exist. But these examples that I gave you relied on some leaked ground truth data or some whistleblowers to expose their underlying strategies. So given some corpus of documents that we suspect might contain manipulative content, how can we identify documents, phrases, and strategies that reflect this manipulation? And in order to do this, what we want to do is develop a generalizable framework, so something that we can operationalize computationally, and also something that we can apply in new domains given some new data set. And the starting point here goes back to this idea that I kind of mentioned in the beginning, which is while we're seeing these types of campaigns happen in larger scales, in more global contexts, in ways that we haven't previously needed to address, they're not entirely new, and they've been well studied in communications and political science literature. So there's one common framework that we draw from here. And this framework breaks media manipulation down into three main components. So the first one is called agenda setting. And this focuses on what topics are covered by a media agency at all. The second one focuses on framing. And this focuses on how those topics are covered. And the third one, which I'm not going to get into as much today, is called priming. And this focuses on what effects this type of reporting has on public opinion. And there's a quote by a communication scholar, Robert Entman, who fits these three dimensions together as tools of power in terms of manipulating public opinion. So in the results, the work that I'm going to show you today, we focus on a Russian newspaper corpus, particularly from a newspaper called Izvestia. And this is a newspaper that is not officially state-owned, but is known to be very heavily influenced by the Russian government. And we did this work a couple of years ago that for kind of a long time, there's been intense interest in the way that Russia is shaping the global information environment. This is perhaps kind of not something that I need to qualify given the ongoing war in Ukraine and sort of very public discussions around misinformation around the conflict. And the idea behind, so the first part of the frame that we focus on is agenda setting. And the idea behind agenda setting is that in these types of manipulation campaigns, it's really hard to change someone's opinion, but it's much easier to distract them and change what they think about. So if we think about when might we expect say, government influenced media to want to shape what people are thinking about, and we can hypothesize that we're likely to see more manipulation strategies when a country is doing poorly. Because when a country is doing poorly, this is a time when a government would want to distract the public or deflect blame from kind of negative events going on in the country and focus on, get the public to focus on something else. And so what do I mean by this? Doing poorly, sort of like a really vague term. But one way that we can get a metric of how well a country is doing is by looking at economic data. And so what we use specifically here is the state of the country's economy, the GDP and the stock market. And these are things that reflect both the kind of economic health of the country, but also sort of major events like protests or something like this, like civil unrest are often reflected in stock market data as well. And so what we can hypothesize using this economic data as a benchmark is that we might expect to see these Russian news articles discuss foreign countries more during economic downturns. And I'm skipping a little bit over some of the motivation here, but this is kind of based on existing work, existing kind of earlier case studies that suggest that discussion of foreign affairs is a way of distracting and deflecting blame for negative domestic affairs. And we focus specifically on the US here because if you look at the foreign countries that are mentioned in Russian media, it's very dominated by mentions of the US. So the first thing that we focus on is just raw frequencies. So the blue line here shows in the figure on the left, shows the percent of articles that mention the US over time. And the red line shows the Russian GDP. And we can see like very visually, there's this strong negative correlation. As the state of the economy starts doing worse, the news starts talking about the US more. When the economy starts doing better, the news starts talking about the US less. And if you repeat these calculations, we can look at this at a yearly, at a quarterly level. This graph is yearly, but if we kind of compute these correlations to other levels or at a monthly level, we find these strong negative correlations at all levels. So this is pretty striking and it's this sort of like very visible negative correlation here. But if we really want to conclude that there's some kind of agenda setting going on, what we want to be able to show is that this correlation is actually directed, that first we see a change in the economy, and then we see a change in the US news coverage. And in order to investigate that, we use a method here it's sort of originally developed for processing economic data. That's called Granger causality. And the backbone behind a Granger causality model is a regression. And so what that means is we build a regression model where we attempt to predict the frequency of US mentions in the news in the current month. And we try to do this prediction using two different variables. So the first is the amount of US news coverage in the previous month. So this assumes that there's some kind of consistency to news coverage. And the second is the amount of the state of the economy in the previous month. And for each of these time series, we take the percent change. So we look at, did the US news coverage go down last month, and did it go down or up this month? And then similarly for the economic data. And then we go and fit this regression model to these time series. And what we pay attention to is the coefficients learned by the model. So if the model assigns a non-zero coefficient to the economic data, that implies that the state of last month's economy is a significant predictor in the state of this month's US news coverage. And then we could conclude that there's a Granger causal effect. So this is what we see when we fit this model. And there's three kind of main things. So the first is that the learned coefficient is significantly different than zero. The second is that the learned coefficient for the economic data is negative. So this is the same trend that we saw in the correlations, that first we see a downturn in the economic data, and that is then followed by an upturn in the amount of US news coverage. And the third is that if we try to fit this model back further than 1 month, so we try to predict US news coverage back 2 or 3 months ago, we no longer find a significant effect. So we can see that there's some kind of time delay happening here, but it doesn't go back longer than 1 month. So overall, this gives us some pretty strong evidence of agenda setting. But what this doesn't really tell us is why this is a media manipulation strategy. Like, what are these articles actually saying about the US? Why is it useful to talk about the US during economic downturns? And so to analyze this, we want to do a little bit of a deeper language analysis. And here we draw on the second part of the framework, which is called framing. And what framing focuses on is exactly this, how these topics are discussed. So framing can happen at kind of, so like, what does that mean? How topics are discussed? Well, framing can happen at kind of a word level or at more of a topic level. So at a topic level, given some kind of issue or event, so the example I have here is given the issue of abortion, you might discuss this issue from more of a moral perspective or from more of a health perspective. And these would be kind of topic level frames. But you also could use more word level frames in describing these issues. So someone might describe whether or not they support access to abortion by describing themselves as pro-life or pro-choice, but no one describes themselves as anti-life or anti-choice. So in order to measure framing in our corpus, we draw from an existing annotated data set of English news articles, and this is called the Media Frames Corpus. And this is a corpus of about 12,000 articles on three different annotated on 3 different issues for 14 different policy frames. And these policy frames were constructed to try to be as comprehensive and as generalizable as possible. So the idea is that they're thought to apply to a broad range of issues, but also meant to capture most of the frames that someone would use for kind of any issue. So this is a great starting point. We already have some kind of annotated data, but the problem is this annotated data that we have is all in English, and the corpus that we want to analyze is a Russian newspaper. It's in Russian. So we can't just kind of train a supervised model here. So how can we adapt these English framing annotations to our Russian news articles? And I'm just going to kind of go through this briefly at a high level. I think if we were to try to redo this project today, we'd probably use a different approach, but just give you a sense of like what we actually did. What we started with is using a query, a lexicon-based approach with a query expansion step. So we start by deriving lexicons from the media frames corpus to identify words that are associated with each frame using word statistics. So here we might infer that the word dollars is associated with the economic frame. We then just directly translate these lexicons into Russian. So here we would get the Russian word for dollars. We then take word embeddings that are trained on our target corpus, that are trained on the Russian newspaper articles, and we use them to add words to our lexicon based on embedding similarities. So what we do in this step is when we do a direct translation, we would find that the Russian word for dollars is associated with the economic frame. But when we do this expansion step, one of the words that we can find is associated with the economic frame is the Russian word for rubles, which is the Russian currency. So this step allows us to do some adaptation of these initial lexicons to the actual target corpus that we want to study. And then finally, we can use these adapted lexicons to identify the frames that are contained in different documents. So the first thing that we can kind of look at is just frames across the whole corpus. And unsurprisingly, we find the external regulation frame is the one that's used most commonly. This makes sense because any article about the US is sort of by definition externally focused. But some of the other frames that we find are more common in articles about the US than other articles include public sentiment, political fairness and equality, morality, and security and defense. And if we look at these, so we can do like a little bit more finer grained analysis by looking at the words and phrases associated with these specific frames. So for each frame, we take articles in the month directly following economic downturns and we compare them against words contained in articles for each frame directly following economic upturns. So we're looking at words that become more common when the economy starts doing worse and then less common when the economy starts doing better. And when we do this, so this slide gives an example just from the security and defense frame. But when we do this kind of across all frames, we find a couple of common themes. So we find content that focuses on villainizing the US. So this includes references within the morality frame. We also find content describing threats to the US. So this includes things like countries that are enemy to the US, references to terrorism, often in the security and defense frame. And then we also find content that focuses on promoting the US military over the Russian military. And so overall, this sort of starts to give a picture as to why descriptions of the US during economic downturns are a manipulation strategy by presenting another government as another country as unsafe, another government as morally corrupt. This makes Russia and the Russian government look better by comparison. So this is what the full pipeline looks like. I won't spend a lot of time on this slide, but effectively we start with a corpus of raw data. We analyze agenda setting using primarily looking at word frequencies and Granger causality. And then we conduct a finer grained language analysis that focuses on framing in order to identify words that coincide with the economic upturns and downturns that we identify during the kind of agenda setting phase. Okay. So where do we go from here? So this is like, we've uncovered this potential pattern, but kind of like, so what? I think that's a lot of the times the question that you end up with work with this is like, how do we actually apply this knowledge? Where is this knowledge useful? And we can think about some of the usefulness of this type of work in two different settings. So one is, what are the societal impacts of this kind of work? And one of them is just straight on the more that we identify and publicize propaganda strategies, this is a way of reducing the credibility of unreliable sources. So this has sort of direct effects on understanding what type of information people should and shouldn't trust. More broadly, and this is also kind of relates to the first point as well, but this research facilitates political science work in general on media manipulation and propaganda, and that can kind of go on to inform policy decisions around what type of media content should be publicized. The other way that we can think about some of the outcomes and impacts of this work is where it's likely to affect NLP research. And so one of the areas where this type of work is very relevant is in thinking about NLP ethics. So there is existing research that has shown ways that NLP systems can perpetuate misinformation. So for example, recommendation systems are likely to promote content that contains conspiracy theories. And if we don't have a sense of what types of manipulation strategies there are, of what type of propaganda strategies exist, when we start thinking about what type of behavior might we not want in NLP systems, we don't even really know what we're looking for. This also kind of more broadly, this work relates to being able to identify subtle connotations in text that can be hard to detect. And it's led to kind of a number of follow-up work by others in examining these types of concepts. Okay, I'm going to talk about a different project, but if there's questions on this part so far, I can pause for a minute. If not, I can keep going.
Any question?
Okay.
Well, I have one question. So let's say, so this work has been published like 2018, right? So there was a big progress on NLP system, and also how the people think of NLP system in terms of ethics, harms, and this also has been changed a lot, right? And also, so what do you are doing the same research today, and what would be like, what techniques are you gonna try in a different way, or what view might be changed in terms of your perspective about this problem?
Yeah, I think there's a lot more potential to look at some of the kind of finer grained connotations that are hard to capture at a word level. And this is something that's been enabled by a lot of advances in cross-lingual models and more having better representations of terms than static word embeddings. So I think that that's something that we'd kind of focus on. I think the other area that we didn't get into as much in this work, but that would be really interesting, is looking at the responses to this type of content, because this thing is not clear. Like, just because the media publishes on a particular topic, is that actually what's picked up by other people? And this is something that you can kind of get at by looking at across platforms. So like, what is the media saying versus what is people posting on social media platforms, and how related are they? And I think that's something that we're actually sort of talking about working on in the next couple of months. But that's, I think, one of the areas that like we left unexplored here, that there's a lot of scope for.
I see. One more question is, once you publish this paper, and it's been cited a lot, right? So have you seen any other societal impact of your paper in terms of like, some stakeholders changed their policy, or maybe some media changed their policy, or have you noticed any like this high level like change in the community?
Yeah, I mean, we haven't really, I haven't really seen policy changes that I could pinpoint around this particular work. I mean, some of this too is that we're looking at Russian newspapers, and it's pretty hard to imagine like Russia caring at all what we think. So there's potentially more usefulness for like other readers who might gain some insight into what news outlets are and are not more trustworthy. And but I don't know that we've seen any sort of particular policy. I think this is something that I kind of took out of this talk for today, but a lot of times in this area of work, I think it's important to build explicit partnerships with people who might be able to have a better sense of where the work can be applied directly. And that's hard to do in this context. Like, we're not going to be working with Russian news agencies realistically. But yeah, like some of the other projects, we're trying to do this.
I see. Thank you. I think there's one question. Oh, maybe we can take Rian's question first, and then you can come. Yeah.
Sure. So reading from the chat, I'm curious about the causality model mentioned at the beginning. Is that applicable to test other information? Yeah, so Granger causality is pretty well used in economic studies. So you could use it. It's basically like usable for any kind of time series analysis, and with some qualifications, like you sometimes need to do some pre-processing of the data to make it applicable. And there is one of the economists that we worked with has used this approach in looking at traffic patterns being predictive of Russian stock market volatility. It's super interesting. They show that like when there's traffic in Moscow in the morning, then like traders get to the office and they're like more angry, and so they trade more aggressively and there's more volatility. So they like the analysis of range of causality.
There are a couple more questions, but before that, you want to ask something?
So I kind of wonder, because the data is like hand annotated, so would that induce a bias on the data itself though? Because like you mentioned that the data is like annotated according to the topic or something like that in the previous slide.
Yeah, I mean, there's some potential for subjectivity. I think the media frames corpus is annotated. So it's originally over 3 different policy issues and was coded by political scientists primarily. And so I think they put a fair amount of effort into recruiting annotators. Like it wasn't crowdsourced, like into recruiting annotators who are actually sort of experts in these subjects. So I think that that goes some way towards reducing some of the kind of noisiness you might expect from human annotations. But certainly there is some potential, like in any kind of human annotated data for you to be capturing things that are subjective.
Cool. And Anjali, we also have a couple questions in the Slido. Could you open the link that I shared?
Oh, yes.
Or I can read for you, or either is fine.
Yeah. Okay.
I can read for you, or can you access?
I have it. Okay. Have you experienced any pushback for doing this work? Kind of. Less than I might have expected. And I will say, like, a number of times I've gotten pushback from the sake of less someone saying that they're not supportive of the work, and more saying, I'm not sure if you should present this because other people are going to think it's too political. So I've like definitely hear that a lot. And I think that yeah, like one of the things that came up in this project is that this is like a really difficult topic for people who are from Russia to work on. So this was one of the areas where like wasn't in discouraging of the work, but also like we worked with some native Russian speakers in order to annotate Russian data, and they didn't want to be associated. They were like, we'll help you with it, but everything stays anonymous. Don't want to be associated with this because like this could be dangerous for us. So I think like in that sense had some of that. Okay. Yeah, can you tell whether or not the persuasive media is done intentionally? Could it be that when the economy goes down, people just decide to post about the US? Okay, so what we're looking at here is, so there's some assumption of intentionality here because we're looking at a newspaper that's known to be heavily influenced by the Russian government. So we sort of know that there's like likely to be some influence on what the newspaper posts here. So is a little bit of an assumption of intentionality. I think that I would say that like it's certainly possible to capture coincidences in these types of analyses, but we see a really consistent pattern over a 13-year period. So I don't really think that this is something that just like happens. It's like when you see that kind of consistency over such a long time frame, especially given kind of existing work in this area, there's a lot more, I don't know, confidence that this is like intentional and not just kind of coincidental. Okay, and is this automatable so that we could run it in other countries? Yeah, so I actually have run this on US data. I ran this on a corpus of New York Times articles and found very little. Some of it is that the US GDP is very uninteresting. It just goes up. So if you look at stuff, I think that I like spent a while looking at this with GDP data. I didn't quite get to the point of running it against stock market data. But I also think like one of the things so the actual kind of pipeline you can run very easily, but one of the things that's very different about the US is depending on what newspaper you're looking at, there's a lot less known government influence. Specifically, there is like You can argue that US newspapers are biased, like sure, but they're not sort of known to be influenced by the government in the same way they are in Russia. The other big difference is that there has been one single political party dominant in Russian government for the last, I don't know, decades. And so in the US, you have to account for party switching, but like you would expect the news coverage to change depending on who's in power. So if you assume like that, say the New York Times has a liberal bias, then you might expect them to do some media manipulation strategies around similar to what we see here during Obama's presidency, but like not during Trump's presidency or something like this. And so the actual kind of straight model you can run, but the type of social variables that you need to take into account are different in a different country. Cool.
Yeah, I guess there's no more questions in here.
Okay. I'll keep going. I'm gonna try to go through the second half a little faster so that there's more discussion time. Yeah, so this kind of, I guess, relates to some of the last question. But the second project that I'm going to talk about that focuses on this space, and the reason that I'm kind of choosing to talk about this is the first project we make this assumption of intentionality, that there's some like intentional manipulation happening here. But a lot of times you see content that can have subtle forms of biases that isn't necessarily intentional, that could be accidental. And this is kind of what we more focus on, what I'm going to more focus on next. And the project that I'm talking about is specifically aimed at identifying signs of implicit gender bias in text. And to give you an example, so one of the data sets that we worked on in this project was Facebook comments addressed towards female politicians. Or sorry, this one actually is towards a female news anchor. So this was a media post posted by a news anchor who posted kind of just like generic content about this is what tonight's news is going to cover. And one of the comments replying to this content was, "I like Bob, but you're hot, so kick his butt." So this isn't the most offensive content on the internet, not by a long way, but it is something that was unsolicited and objectifying. And if you see repeated exposure to these types of comments can be demoralizing. It's the kind of thing that deters women from using social media, prevents them from becoming public figures because they don't want to be exposed to this type of content. And there's also kind of scenarios outside of social media where it's pretty clear that this type of content is not appropriate. So in things like hiring decisions, admissions decisions, workplace settings, content that is gendered content like this can derail women's careers. And to go back to this concept of like, where do we care about this in an NLP space when we're building NLP models? These aren't the kind of things you want a chatbot to say to someone. I'd be pretty unhappy if I had an Alexa and it said things like this to me. So there's kind of incentives here as to why we might want automated ways to identify content that can be biased, but in a way that might be subtle and difficult to detect. So there are existing NLP approaches to identifying content that can be offensive. And this includes like models for hate speech detection. But these types of models aren't going to detect comments like the examples that I gave you here, because these comments are not overtly offensive. They're not even necessarily explicitly negative. So we can't even think like, oh, a negative sentiment, that's not going to catch this kind of thing. But they are more focused on condescension and objectification. So if we were to try to, even if we kind of can't take an existing, say, hate speech classifier to detect subtle things like microaggressions, we might be able to take a classic NLP pipeline approach. And what that would look like is we scrape a bunch of data, we crowdsource some annotations, and then we train a supervised classifier to detect comment is biased or comment is not biased. And this actually relates directly to the question that someone asked earlier. Why might we think that this might not work that well in this setting? Well, we're aiming to detect biases that can be subtle and implicit, that are dependent on context. So they're really difficult to identify in isolated text incidents, and we don't necessarily expect annotators to do a good job of identifying them. So instead of relying on subjective human judgments, the approach that I'm going to pose here is to come up with an approach that doesn't rely on these kinds of human judgments. And instead, we start with intuition. that we can identify gender bias as systemic differences in comments addressed towards men and towards women. So we have a comment that's very likely to be addressed towards a woman, and it's something that's very unlikely to be addressed towards a man. Then we can say it probably contains some component of gender bias. And based on this intuition, we can train a classifier to predict the gender of the person that a comment is addressed towards. And if the classifier makes a prediction with high confidence, then we say the content is likely to contain gender bias. So there are some challenges behind this approach. And what those kind of challenges are is that text is very likely to contain content that is predictive of gender, but that's not necessarily indicative of bias. And particularly, there's 3 different types of content that we identify as possible confounding variables, as things that are predictive of gender, but not indicative of bias. And I'll go through them in a little bit more detail, but to give you an overview, the first one is that text often contains explicitly gendered keywords like sir, ma'am. So these are kind of giveaways of gender, but like they're not really indicative of bias. The second is that text is not posted in isolation, particularly if we're looking at things like social media. Things are posted in context. And if there are correlations between the surrounding context and gender, this can turn into a confounding variable. And the third is characteristics of the people in the conversation other than gender. And this is something that there are people in the conversation might have characteristics that are correlated with gender. So these are things that can be predictive of gender, but again, not really indicative of bias. And I'll give you like a clear example of that in a moment. So our kind of goal, so our main goal in this project is to identify this type of content that is predictive of gender, but not indicative of bias, and reduce the influence of these confounding variables in our classification model. So we want to prevent the model from learning this type of content that's predictive of gender and not indicative of bias in order to surface comments that do contain gender bias. So in order to, we kind of approach each of these 3 different confounding variables separately. And I'm going to just kind of give you a high level overview in the interest of time. But what we do is, for the easiest one to control for is overtly gendered terms. We can just substitute these out of the text using word lists. The second variable that we want to control for is the surrounding context of comments. And to understand why this is a confounding variable in our model, these comments are likely to contain references to posts made before them. And so there's elements of these comments that are caused by the preceding context and that are not caused by the gender of the person that they're addressed towards. So let me kind of give you a more specific example to try to make it a little bit more clear. So this is again from one of the data sets that we worked with, which is Facebook comments that are addressed towards female politicians. And here we're looking at kind of a single turn dialogue setting. So we have a politician made a Facebook post, and we want to detect gender bias in comments that are replying to that post. So we're simplifying the surrounding context to the post that a comment is replying towards. And if we look at the posts that are made by male and female politicians, we can see that these politicians often talk about different topics. So female politicians post a lot more about, say, Title IX. And that means that comments replying to those posts also refer to Title IX. So if we were to train a classifier on these comments that are addressed towards male and female politicians, it's likely to learn that references to Title IX are predictive of a female addressee, are predictive of the fact that the comment is addressed towards a woman. But that's not really a sign of gender bias. That's a direct reflection of the original posts that were made by these politicians. So we don't want the model to learn features that are predictive of these original posts. And if we look more broadly across this data set, this is looking at word statistics of comments posted of posts made by male and female politicians. And we can see that there's certain words that are overrepresented in posts made by female politicians as compared to male politicians. Female politicians post more about sexual assault. So the way that we reduce the influence of these types of this type of content in our classification model is we use a method that is called propensity matching. And propensity matching is a method that was originally developed for causal inference studies. And so our goal in this overall project has some alignment with causal framing. What we're trying to do is identify text that's predictive of gender, but that's not predictive of other confounding variables. And this is sort of a lot of what causal inference work that we're drawing from aims to do. So what does that kind of actually mean? How do we apply a propensity matching here? Well, we start with these Facebook posts that are made by men and women, by male and female politicians. And we train a classifier to predict the gender of the person that each of these posts were written by. And then we take the scores that are outputted by this classifier as propensity scores. So these propensity scores are estimates of the probability that the post was written by a woman, regardless of who the original author of the post was. Then for each post that was actually written by a woman, we match it to a post that was actually written by a man that has the most similar propensity score. And any data that we can't match, we discard. So what we're doing here is we're building a data set that is balanced in terms of how predictive preceding context is of gender. So what that means is if we were to train a classifier on this new data set that we've balanced, we no longer expect it to learn features that are predictive of preceding context because we've broken that correlation between preceding context and gender in our training data. And so when we do this over a data set, when we do propensity matching, we can see that over a newly balanced data set, we no longer find these words as associated with posts made by male or female politicians in our training data set. So we've broken that correlation between context and gender. So this is the way that we prevent the model from learning features that are predictive of preceding context when we're trying to train it to predict gender. The last part of the model, and I think I'm not going to go into a lot of depth here because I also think you're going to learn more about this later. The last trait that we aim to control for is characteristics of the people in the conversation other than their gender. And we do this through adversarial training. So we construct a classification model where we train the model to predict the gender of the person that a comment is addressed towards. And then we represent features that we don't want the model to learn as a latent trait vector. And we introduce an adversary that's explicitly trained to predict this latent trait vector. And then we train our kind of total classification model using a two-part loss function that incentivizes the model to fool this adversary, but also predict the actual value that we want the model to learn, which is gender of the addressee. So I'm kind of going over this really high level. If you're interested, feel free to check out the paper or you can follow up with me. Yeah, I don't want to spend the whole rest of the time on this, so I'm going to move on. So basically, what we're doing in this, our kind of overall goal in this adversarial training approach as well, is to encourage our model to learn traits that are predictive of gender of the addressee and not that are predictive of other confounding variables that we don't want the model to learn. So this is what kind of the full pipeline looks like. We identify these characteristics that can be predictive of gender, but not indicative of bias. And we discourage the model from learning these traits by using word substitutions, by using propensity matching, and by using adversarial training. And after we train the whole model in this way, we can evaluate how well it works. We evaluate how well it works by using a corpus of self-reported microaggressions. And this is something that was actually kind of really challenging in this work, was figuring out how to evaluate the model. Because our whole premise in this project is that we don't want to rely on bias annotations. We don't believe that annotator judgments are reliable in this setting. So then how do we evaluate the model if we're trying not to use annotated data? So that's why we kind of landed on this corpus of self-reported microaggressions. And what the task that we developed here is, this is a data set where people have reported microaggressions that they faced, and they can tag what are the kind of relevant factors to the microaggression. And so we use our model to detect gender-based microaggressions from other types of microaggressions. So the model is not trained at all for this task. We only trained it on this gender predictive task on this Facebook data set of predicting gender of the addressee. But we can evaluate how well it performs on this kind of like totally untrained domain in detecting gender-based microaggressions. And since we find that it performs better than random, this implies that the model has encoded some information about gender bias. So after we train this model, one of the kind of use cases of a model like this is just rate detection in comments and things like social media posts or workplace communications. But one of the other things that we can use this model for is to analyze what patterns it learns. So we can use this as a way of understanding what features are indicative of gender bias in the setting. And this was something that we kind of avoided defining in the beginning by not relying on human judgments. And we did this in 2 different settings. So we look at Facebook comments that the model predicted as addressed towards women with high confidence in a data set of Facebook comments addressed towards male and female politicians. And when we look at the features that the model focuses on, it contains a lot of references to competence and traditionally domestic terms. So things like force and situation, but also words like spouse or love. But when we repeat this experiment, we take the same model and we train it on a data set of comments addressed towards other types of female public figures. So things like actresses and tennis players, the types of comments that the model identifies as containing gender bias are ones that focus on appearance and sexualization. So this includes words like beautiful and love. And so what we can kind of see is that this goes back towards the motivation of our work. In what we're aiming to do here is, even if we were to kind of collect a data set that's annotated for gender bias in one domain, it's likely not going to translate to a new domain because we can see that bias depends on social context and it's different in different settings. Okay, that was a really quick overview of that project. Hopefully you got a little bit out of it. So I had a couple of slides left. Do we have time for that?
I think the class ends 5:15, so I think it should be fine. Yeah, unless
Okay.
you have to go early or.
Great. No, I'm good until then.
Okay, and I guess we have one question in the Slido.
Okay. Yeah, how do you know when you found all of the confounding variables? Yeah, that's a good question. So the way that we did this was basically by training the model and looking at the words that the model assigned the highest attention weights to, and then determining if, and that was where the variables that we focused on originated from to begin with. So this concept of that I kind of like skipped over, but the ones that we aim to demote adversarially are traits of the addressee other than gender. So things like for politicians, that means like the state that the congressperson is representative of. And we can see that our model controls for that because when we add in this adversarial training, like we no longer see names of states appearing in the words that the model tends to. So that's kind of the main way that we did it, by just like looking at what words the model is attending to and seeing if those are words that we need to demote. So it's possible that there's ones that we missed, and that maybe we would get better model performance if there's like additional confounding variables that we incorporated with. But we think that this kind of captured the biggest ones that we were seeing in the model outputs.
Cool. I have a couple of questions, but yeah, I'd like to hear your third topic. So yeah, you can go.
Okay. The last one's I'm gonna be kind of brief. But I wanted to bring this up because the work that I'm talking about today, so I think there's a lot of vagueness in the words we use to talk about. So I'm using the word social-oriented NLP or social NLP, but there's also NLP ethics, there's NLP for social good, there's social computing, and I think there's like a lot of mixtures in these terms. But kind of fundamentally what a lot of this work focuses on is NLP that's about people. And when we're thinking about NLP that's getting deployed in people-centric settings, a lot of times this technology can have unintended consequences. So one of these topics that I'm talking about, you have these goals of reducing online harassment and people-centric tasks. And so this is an area where we can see around this type of social-oriented research that people are kind of innately involved. But this is really sort of true of any sort of NLP system in general, that language is fundamentally produced by people. Any data that we're using was written by people. People are the people who build models, who use models, who are affected by them. And so I don't want to focus this whole talk on these are ways that NLP can make everything in society better, because there's also sort of a lot of harms that can come from these types of systems, especially when they're deployed in ways where we aren't being careful. So I wanted to give one example specifically that because it's related to what I just talked about. which is on reducing online toxicity. And there's a lot of work in NLP that focuses on reducing, on improving online civility. So there's a huge branch of NLP work on hate speech detection. And a lot of the original motivation behind this work, especially if you go back and look at some of the early papers, is specifically around that online harassment often disproportionately affects already kind of marginalized people. So women or people of color are often most affected by things like online harassment. So this is sort of one of the goals of this whole line of research is how to improve civility for marginalized people. But what kind of has happened in practice is there's been more recently a series of work, a couple of papers showing that a lot of these models that have been developed, some of the kind of like commercialized ones that have been developed for detecting toxic language, are more likely to falsely label text as offensive if it contains characteristics of African American English, or if it contains particular identity terms. So words like Black, so words like I am a woman or like I am Black is rated as being more offensive than words like I am white by a lot of hate speech and offensive language models. I shouldn't say a lot, there's particular models that have been tested. And some of these models, some of this kind of can get blamed on just like correlations that happen in the data. So if we were able to sort of properly control for confounds in the data, then maybe we could prevent them. But some of these types of outputs also are related to the ways that these data and labels and annotations are collected. So what instructions are actually provided to annotators. Annotators are less likely to label tweets as containing African American English as offensive if they're told that the tweet contains African American English. And also annotators who have different beliefs annotate text differently as well. And so what that means is that this kind of work that we see around toxic language started with this original goal of helping and improving online civility, particularly for marginalized people, but it has a sort of unintended censorship effect in that we're actually likely to falsely label text as offensive and further marginalize the very people that this technology is aiming to help. And I want to kind of give these examples. I'm going to give like one more very briefly, just because I think that when you're thinking about social oriented NLP and people centric NLP, we need to be very conscious about like who is actually getting affected by these technologies that we're building. So I'll give one kind of quick example as well. This is around research in facial recognition technology. So there was a very high profile paper from a couple of years ago. If you follow kind of anything in the ethics space, you've probably seen it, showing that commercial facial recognition systems perform worse for people with darker skin. And so this led to kind of a follow-up work specifically focused on improving the diversity in the data used to train these models. So the concept was these models work worse on people with darker skin because we don't train them on the right training data. Our training data is not representative of actual population. So we need more diverse training data for this model. And this led a group of researchers to collect data set that they call diversity in faces. But what actually happened was eventually they used data sets from existing public platforms that were posted by users who had not explicitly consent to their use of photos in data sets used for training machine learning models. And so ultimately they ended up taking down this data set because they got sued. And so this is again kind of work that went towards, started with a goal, which was improving fairness in these technologies, but had this kind of unintended privacy violation effect. So this is kind of the thought that I'll leave you with. And there's sort of other work in this space as well. I'm not going to get into, but this was the motivation that I started with this in the beginning, which is like, we want to expand the view of natural language processing. We want to be able to integrate ideas from theories and other fields in order to address these broad social oriented challenges. But none of this work is being done in an isolated research community. It's going to affect people in other spaces. And so we need to be doing this kind of work in partnerships with other agencies, with other types of people, and with people from other disciplines, if we want to be able to avoid these types of unintended effects. And I'll end there and thank everyone, all of the people whose work I've referenced in this talk, and have, I think, about 5 minutes left if there's any kind of last questions.
Let's give it applause first. This is amazing. Thank you so much. Yeah. Okay, any question? Yeah. I have two questions. Yeah, let me start first. So you mentioned about like the data set should be more well balanced and data set should be carefully collected or equally balanced and so on. Do you also think the model itself should be handling this bias or bias-free model should be developed or causal patterns should be considered in the model learning? So, or have you seen any other work that can like handle this kind of issues in the model?
Yeah, I mean, I think it depends a lot. So I think the often like what we really care about is how the model is going to perform when it's interacting with users. And so what criteria we care about in a model depends a lot on the task. So a model that outputs content that's not professional is maybe fine if it's being used as like a social media bot, but not fine if it's being used as, I don't know, in like a help desk system. And so I think that that sort of end goal of what in the model performance we actually care about is like what shapes a lot of the question around where in the model pipeline should we be trying to control for potential outputs. And so that means in some settings, like maybe it does make sense to really focus on constraints in the model training process. And that's like the right approach towards controlling the output. But in some other settings, especially in settings where we don't necessarily know exactly how the model is going to be used, then maybe we need kind of a lot more focus on what data is getting fed into the model where we don't know exactly what it might be learning from the data. So I definitely think it's context dependent.
I see. That makes sense. Second question is, yeah, we do have some students who like to study like computational social science. And do you have any like principle or suggestion, like how you approach the problem, how you find the hypothesis, how you develop this technical stuff, and how you come up with the conclusion? And then, yeah. So do you have any like a typical process, how you do?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of tricky. I mean, I think a lot of times for me, projects have started with data, that you sort of start with some interesting data set, and then a lot of the project is around what are we trying to look at in this data, and how can we measure what we want to measure in the data, and usually that involves building some model that doesn't exist yet. I think that the other thing that's really helpful is to try to talk to people in that space. Like it's really hard to read research from other fields. If you just like search for work that's relevant to yours, sometimes you find what you're looking for, but often it's like, are you really finding what's actually kind of the relevant work and what other people in that field would recognize? And I think like one of the really easiest and best ways to do it is to just try to ask someone. And usually I've had like pretty good luck with just reaching out to, so like we were working on a project that's looking at social media movements and like what motivates online activism, and just like emailed a couple students in HCI about it. And one of them was like, oh yeah, I did a project on this, and here are some of the papers that are most relevant and things like that. So I think that like that kind of thing helps a lot. Yeah, I mean, it's great to be like, oh, read as much as you can from other fields, but like realistically, it's really hard to read psychology papers. And it's a lot easier if you can actually just kind of ask someone what's the most relevant.
Cool, that's really helpful. We have a one question in the Slido. Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Okay. To what extent do models without disparity, can models without disparities be considered debiased? I think the term debiased is really vague and deceptive, because I think that we like where we care about models is often in and task performance and in deployed settings. And so the concept of like I think that unless we're looking at how a model is performing in the setting that it's deployed, then it's not like really meaningful. And the term that you're going to use in a deployed system is like almost never debiased. I don't know if that answers the question, but I guess like maybe some people would consider them debiased, but I'd like try to avoid using that term because I don't really consider anything to be debiased.
Oh, then you have a question.
This is something I might want to talk to you more about offline, but have you thought about creating it into like a tool that people could use to detect whether or not their own words were like biased online. Like I'm thinking like on Facebook, all of my friends have like a lot of them have gender info, and it would be really cool if I could like have a little AI that was watching as I type stuff and like keep the data local on my computer, but use a model that would tell me like, hey, you seem to be responding to this person like they're a woman. Do you want to rethink what you're posting? Like that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think that's actually like probably one of the most potentially useful applications of this kind of work. Because you're never going to use a model like this for removing content from a platform. Like it's not trying to detect things that are violations of terms of service. And a lot of times these types of contents are made unintentionally. So the actual setting where I think this is really relevant, and we're actually like one of my lab mates is more focusing on this, but have been collaborating with a company that is focused on identifying this type of content in workplace communications. And that's more the goal, which is on the user side end of being able to kind of like understand the implications of your text as someone else might read them. So like, should you really say this to your coworker? Yeah, so I definitely think that's like a potential use. I think in practice, I don't think the technology is good enough to be deployed. Like, yeah, we were able to show that the model learns things and that we're doing something that's non-random and able to pick up some patterns in the text, but like the performance isn't perfect. And I think if you tried to deploy this, like it'd make a lot of mistakes.
Okay.
So someday, but yeah.
How does that work with the bias too? Because I know like if you understand somebody's diversity or culture or whatnot well enough to reply in like a more nuanced way because you understand that, does it make differences between that? Or does it just say, well, because you respond in this more nuanced way, it's clear that you like are making assumptions about who this person is? Like, it seems like in some cases we might want bias if it's understanding bias rather than like against you sort of bias.
Yeah, so that's a good question. And I think that there are, I think that like we are taking the assumption that this is a situation where you shouldn't be addressing people of different genders differently. And if it is a situation where that is the case, then maybe this isn't the right model to be using in that setting. But we're more looking at things at situations like in something like performance reviews within a company. If the company is debating giving people promotions and they're using different languages to describe people of different genders, that's not really a behavior that we would expect. But in like a conversation with your friends or something like this, then maybe it is like a lot more appropriate to be acknowledging of differences of people. So yeah, there is definitely like this assumption that that's what we care about, and that might not be true everywhere.
Cool. Thank you very much. Really like the talk.
Thanks.
Any other question? I see, yeah, some new questions coming up. Yeah. Yeah, we have a new question on the slide.
Oh, okay. So what other relevant examples from other fields do you know that NLP researchers can use to increase inclusion or diversity in NLP? Yeah. So I think that this is kind of a tough question because it's really broad. This sort of paper that I pulled a couple of references from at the end about race and NLP talks about this a little bit more specifically, drawing from examples from HCI as well as linguistics. And these are fields that kind of focus a lot on people relations, which sort of NLP does, but also sort of NLP doesn't always do. So I think that there's kind of more examples there. I think in general that like when you think about inclusion or diversity in NLP, there's sort of all kinds of levels of this. It's like who is actually conducting the research, who is the research actually going to affect? So like what topics are you working on broadly within the field? And then within those topics, are the models that you're building actually behaving in the ways that you want to for different people? So like, are you working on only English, or are you working on other languages? And then within English, if you release an English model, does it perform the same way for different speakers of English? So I think there's kind of like a lot of different layers. So I think that, yeah, like I kind of, not to just refer you to the paper, but I think that we explore that a little bit more there. I think that there's a lot of other programs, a lot of other fields that have made pushes to build bridges with across disciplines. And I think that this is something that like we could do more as well. Sorry, that was kind of vague, but it's a broad space. I don't want to try to talk too much about it in like a short time span.
Okay, so I think we are slightly over the time, so maybe we can give you another applause and then we can finish. Thank you so much, Anjali. Okay, then we can finish. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. I hope you like the talk.
Yeah.